Okay, hi everybody. Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you all for watching. In this video, what I want to do is pick up on our discussion of Plato's Euthyphro. So far we've talked a bit about some setting issues and the basic question that the Euthyphro covers and deals with. So what I'll do this time is talk about a couple of Euthyphro's definitions and Socrates' responses to them. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you've read enough of Plato's Euthyphro to know that Euthyphro offers a series of definitions and Socrates responds to them. So we'll talk about a couple of the definitions, and then in the next video, we'll cover the remaining. So there's two that we'll cover this time, and then there are three that we'll cover in the next video. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in here. So we looked at this slide last time. I just want to make sure that we're doing good. Actually, make it a little bit bigger for you. Um, Presentation style. There you go. So we know that the central question is what is piety. We know that the conversation partners, they're sometimes called interlocutors in the tradition of Plato's Euthyphro, are Euthyphro and Socrates, and that's it. Nobody else features in the dialogue as a conversation partner. And we're dealing with this question, what is piety? Conversely, what is impiety? Now, our focus will be mostly on what piety is, but once we know what piety is, then we would know what impiety is. It's just going to be the opposite. So where it's needed, we'll bring in a discussion of impiety, because both of them feature in the text, but in a way of simplifying things and getting to the heart of the matters, if you will, I'll be focusing on the search for piety. Okay, but just know that what comes with that is also a search for impiety. So we looked at this slide as well, and I left you with a question that hopefully now you can answer. So the question is, what does what is piety mean? And there are three possibilities. It could mean, what are examples of piety? So, like imagine a little kid asking you, like, what does flower mean? Okay, or they ask you, what is a flower? Well, they might be asking you for examples of a flower. If they're a little kid. So then you so point to, a lily, a rose, an iris, a violet, whatever, and just give this to define in that kind of way. So that's a possible way of defining what piety is to provide some examples. So we do that in ordinary conversation all the time. Another way in which we define things is by way of synonyms. So we don't provide examples, but we, maybe go to our thesaurus and find a term that we understand better. And so we look for a synonym for something. So, someone wants to know, I don't know, the meaning of something like bachelor. So then we find the word, unmarried man or unmarried male or something like that. As an example. So maybe what Socrates is looking for is something like what we would call a linguistic definition. Like, how does a linguistic community use the term piety? What are synonyms of piety? Okay, and we define things like that all the time, right? And then, what is the essence of piety? And here we'd be looking for, again, the universal characteristic or universal feature that everything that's pious has. Okay, that explains why the thing is pious in the first place, if I could put it that way. So the essence is sometimes called the form or the nature of piety. So in this case, it would be like, take all the examples of things that count as pious. It'd be the thing that each one of those examples has in common that explains their being pious. Okay, so what is the correct understanding of this question? What is piety? And I'm hoping that at this point you'd be able to answer that question. Is it A, is it B, or is it C? And if you don't know yet, maybe pause the video, go to the text and see if you can figure out. It happens pretty early, and then you can come back to the video and get the right answer. But hopefully you know the answer. Is it A, B, or C? The answer is C. What is the essence of piety? Okay. So, if it's helpful to think about it, maybe a different kind of example, imagine someone asks, what is water? And you might ask them, well, what do you mean by your question? What do you mean by the question, what is water? Are you looking for examples of water? So where you might point to the Pacific Ocean, you might point to the Atlantic Ocean, you might point to this lake, this river, right? You might point to Lake Nacimiento, or you might point to, the Nile in Egypt or something like that, right? You start giving examples, right? Or, you might, in a search for a synonym for water, provide maybe a set of descriptions, like maybe it'd be something like, colorless, odorless, liquid at room temperature, substance that fills our lakes, rivers, and oceans, etc. Okay. Um, Perhaps there are other better synonyms to use, but that's kind of what comes to my head immediately. But the essence of water, if you're asking for what the essence of water is, well, you're looking for the thing that explains why every example of water is an example of water in the first place. And we know what the essence of water is, presumably. We know that it's H2O. We know it has something to do with the microphysical structure of, of the substance that makes the relevant substance water. Okay, so when we try to find out what the essence of water is, well, we know it's H2O. Okay, so in a way, what Socrates is looking for, he's looking for something similar to what scientists are looking for when they search for the essence, the form, or the nature of water. They're looking for the thing that explains why it's, in this case, when scientists are looking for water, for the essence of water. But here, in the case of piety, it's the thing that explains why something counts as piety in the first place. So hopefully this water example, the scientific example, helps us understand better the significance of these possibilities, and helps us understand like why Socrates, or what Socrates means when he says like, I'm looking for the essence of piety, not just examples of them. So in the text, Socrates doesn't discuss synonyms of piety. That's not an option. But the examples point does come up. Okay. I just mentioned the synonyms of piety because that's a way that we commonly define things. And note what I did here. So 2a, what are examples of piety? So now here I'm using the term piety here, and it's supposed to get to examples of things that would be pious in the world, right? So piety here is used to refer to going to religious festivals, praying to the gods, worshiping the gods, offering incense to the gods, helping the needy, whatever would count as pious. With B, when I put these quotes around piety, I'm signifying that this expression refers to the word. Okay. So when we don't have the quotes here, like in A and C, the term should take us to the world, right? It has some reference to the world. Because what we say, we're using the word. And when we use the word, typically what we're doing is we're going to the word. But when you mention the word, you typically will put it in quotes or otherwise try to capture the idea that you're talking about the word itself. So what are synonyms of piety? We're talking about synonyms of the word piety. Okay, it doesn't make sense to say what are synonyms of piety without the quotes, because um, I mean, context can make it clear for us, but allow this context to be a clear one where we're trying to capture the word, the meaning of the word here, because things in the world don't have synonyms, but words and other linguistic items, right, have synonyms. Okay, so synonyms are the domain of linguistic items, you might say, um, at least as a first pass on the topic. So you see the difference between using a term to try to get to the world and mentioning a word to talk about the word itself. That's what's happening with B. And again, that example isn't discussed in the Euthyphro. I just mention it because it is one way that we define things. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. So we learned that Socrates is looking for C when he asks the question, what is piety? And conversely, what is impiety? Um, we learn this in the context of Euthyphro very quickly offering his first definition when Socrates is like, hey, what is piety, given that you seem to be an expert on the topic? He says, well, it's doing what I'm doing, Socrates. It's prosecuting wrongdoers and things like that. And what's impious is not prosecuting wrongdoers and things like that. Okay. So so this kind of happens quickly in the text. And if you're not paying attention, you can miss the first definition. So let the first definition be captured by what I'm just going to call PWD here. Okay. PWD for prosecuting wrongdoers. Okay. So piety is prosecuting wrongdoers, etc., etc. Okay. Okay. So Socrates' response is really threefold if we reconstruct it. So keep in mind that like a lot of what we're doing here is based on, having studied the Euthyphro carefully, we can reconstruct what's going on in it. Okay, as you know, it's in dialogue form, and it's like a conversation is occurring between two people. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture the key points of the conversation. So Socrates' response again ends up being threefold. So one, PWD, the first definition that Euthyphro offers, doesn't provide the essence of piety. Rather, at best, it provides an example or a set of examples of piety or of things that would count as pious. Likewise, if we were to add to PWD the idea of not prosecuting wrongdoers as impious, well, then we'd have a set of examples of things which would count as impious. And then two, the essence of piety is that which explains why something is pious in the first place. Okay. So we want to know why something is an example of piety. And likewise, the essence of piety is that which makes something pious. So when Socrates asks the question, what is piety? He wants to know, right, the thing in the world that constitutes piety, right? So when we have a pious event like attending a religious festival or praying to the gods, like what feature in the world constitutes piety in those cases? Okay. So explains and making. So you might think that when you have an answer to three, that gives you an answer to two. Okay, so I'm just teasing out three different ways of understanding Socrates' response. Okay, so that's a way of thinking about Socrates' response. Again, just Euthyphro's first definition. So class question here, something to ask yourself, maybe pause the video at this point. Would Socrates have been satisfied with Euthyphro's first definition had it included every example of piety, every possible example of piety, right, and or every possible example of impiety? Like yes or no. So if you're following the reading carefully and you understand the significance of Socrates' response, that puts you in a nice position to answer this class question. And if you're not able to answer this class question, then well, that's what I'm here for, okay? To help you understand the significance of the class question and the answer that we're going to give. Okay, so would Socrates have been satisfied with Euthyphro's first definition had it included every example of piety? And again, if you don't know the answer, maybe pause the video and see if you can think it through. But I'm going to move on now. And oops, the answer is going to be no. Why? Because even if every example or every possible example of something pious were to have been provided by Euthyphro, that still wouldn't tell us what explains or what makes something pious. Okay, we want to know what makes everything pious. So even if Euthyphro had spent 5 pages listing off everything that counted as pious, everything from attending religious festivals, praying and worshiping the gods, helping the needy, and doing your Phil 231 homework, right? You have that list, but you don't know why they're on the list in the first place. So hopefully that makes sense and that helps us better understand what Socrates is looking for. So sometimes these are called Socratic definitions. Socrates is looking for the form or the definition, the form or the essence of something when he looks for a definition. And sometimes they're called nowadays real definitions because we're looking for the thing in the world that that constitutes the thing we're trying to define. Okay, so we're not looking for a linguistic definition. Okay, and we're not looking for examples. We're looking for this other kind of thing. Okay. it's kind of cool to know, there are different ways that we can try to define things, and Socrates is giving us one way. Now, the example that I gave with water a few moments ago was a bit anachronistic, right? Because in a way, Socrates is one of the grandfathers, one of the grandparents to a tradition that allowed us to answer the scientific question, to even pose the scientific question, what is water, and mean by that, what is the essence of water? Okay, so it's one of the cool contributions that we get from Socrates is that he gives us a framework, a way of thinking about certain kinds of questions that then opens the door for general application. He's looking for piety, but a scientist could look for the essence of something like water. Okay. So, anyways, a pretty interesting fact, So the example is anachronistic, and it's figures like Socrates in the tradition, the philosophical tradition, that have paved the way for scientists who, at theoretical edges of their discipline, try to find essences of things. Okay. Now, as I said, there are five definitions that we're going to cover. We'll do two this time and then three next time. We just did one, so we have one more to go. But just important thing to note here is the next four definitions we look at, so besides the first one, will all involve attempting to define piety in terms of the Athenian gods. Okay, so this captures the intuitive idea that piety, being religiously devout or being moral more generally, has a connection to theology. So we tend to think that if someone's pious, when we understand being pious in narrow terms, we tend to understand someone who's again religiously devout, as I have it on the slide, or is spiritually righteous or something like that. Of course, those synonyms or those ways of characterizing piety all have some connection, don't they, to concepts related to theology or religion. Okay. And I have this point about being moral here as maybe a way of understanding piety when we understand it maybe more broadly or more generally, because some people interpret Plato through Socrates and Euthyphro as being not just concerned with the narrow sense of piety, but also in the broad sense of being concerned with morality generally. Or perhaps we learn something very about morality itself by thinking about a more specific case of morality, which is a kind of religious morality, which is to be spiritually devout, which is to be pious. So hopefully that point makes sense here, and we can talk about that a bit more as we go on. But there is something intuitive, at least according to the narrow definition of piety, that is connected to something theological or religious. So by theological, hopefully that point is clear. I mean something related to the study of the science of the logic of religion. So science understood more broadly, not in the way that you might understand it nowadays with the scientific method and the observational method, etc. Okay, science, as a term, just means knowledge in the tradition, or the search for knowledge. Okay, so and some people obviously think that morality is deeply connected to religion. Okay, and so some people, when they study Euthyphro, they say, well, in the case of spiritual morality or religious morality, we learn that there's a connection, or we have this discussion of the connection between that and the gods. Well, perhaps what we learn from the Euthyphros can apply to thinking about the connection between morality and the gods, or morality and religion more generally. And we'll see that that there's that many have thought that Plato's Euthyphro does work in trying to show that the connection might not be as strong as people think. Okay, so let's push forward and look at the next definition. So it's important to note, we have the first definition, which is this sort of definition by examples, as we saw with PWD. Now we're going to move on and look at four other definitions, and we'll just list them off here. Just so you get a flavor of the ones we'll cover next time. But the first one I just call BGL subscript S. Why? Because this is the definition is piety is being God loved. Okay, so BGL is being God loved. Okay, I have the subscript S here for some of the gods. All you need is some of the gods to love the thing, and the thing's going to count as pious. And all I mean by some is at least one. Okay, the logical sense of some. And then I have BGL2 because we're going to universalize the definition to get piety as being loved by all the gods. So this is definition 2, BGLS. BGLU is the third definition. The fourth is what I call CFG, piety is justly caring for the gods. So caring for the gods is CFG, so that's why I call it that. So justly caring for the gods. And APS, piety is praying and sacrificing to the gods. Okay. The art of prayer and sacrifice is the way I understand is why I have APS. Some people, when they've interpreted and reconstructed Euthyphro's fifth definition, they've called it the art of praying and sacrifice. So I'm paying homage to that and trying to just stay with my 3 letters per definition acronym. Okay, so these are supposed to help you for remembering the definitions too, and the order of them. So it's important to keep the order straight because that's the order of the text that may help you with understanding Socrates' responses as well. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll focus on BGLS this time, and then we'll turn to BGLU, CFG, and APS next time. Okay, so remember the S here just means some, and the some really just connects to gods. Being God loved, being God loved by some of the gods, or being loved by some of the gods, and all that's meant by some is at least one, but of course that's consistent with more than one. Okay, so piety is being God loved. Let's focus on that. So we'll talk about this definition, Socrates' response to it, and then a couple of legacy points in our remaining time here. Okay, I should say at any point this is unclear, note the unclarity, and let me know how I can help you. Okay, certainly not perfect in presentation, but would like to continue to get better. I can get better by getting feedback and questions from all of you. Okay, so BGLS, piety is just being God loved. Okay, so Socrates, he claims that this definition fails for Euthyphro even, because Euthyphro also believes something else about the gods. He believes that the gods disagree with each other on what they love. Okay, they also disagree with each other about a whole host of other things. So you may have noticed in the text, some of this seems like it's setting throwaway, but it turns out to be important. So you may have noticed how Socrates and Euthyphro have a disagreement about the issue of whether the gods disagree with each other in general. So, Euthyphro, we know, is prosecuting his father for murder. Euthyphro claims that his father murdered a servant, who in turn murdered a servant. The details on that are really that the servant who murdered a servant got bound by the Euthyphro's father and thrown in a ditch. And while Euthyphro's father's emissaries went to the priest to figure out what to do about the situation in order to cleanse the home of the pollution in the home, the servant who was bound, the murdering servant who was bound, he died. So Euthyphro claims that his father is guilty of murder. As prosecuting his father on those grounds, Socrates is a bit surprised that he'd be prosecuting his own father for murder. And Euthyphro reminds Socrates, and in a way is reminding Athenians in general, because you get the sense that other Athenians are bothered or on Euthyphro for prosecuting his own father for murder. And Euthyphro, so he reminds Socrates that Zeus punished his own father, Cronos, and Zeus is obviously an important god in the Greek pantheon of gods. And if that's the case, then Euthyphro is just doing what the gods have done, and the gods serve as a precedence for legality, for what's acceptable. So if the gods can prosecute or punish their own parents, their own family, well, then Euthyphro can do so as well. And Athenians are just wrong to think that Euthyphro is wrong in prosecuting his own father for murder, and Socrates shouldn't be so surprised. Socrates responds by saying, do you really think the gods fight in a war with each other? Do you really think that the gods do things that would warrant punishment? Okay. Okay. Euthyphro's like, yeah, I believe that. So he's a traditionalist when it comes to Athenian theology. And in a way, he's a revivalist because he's trying to revive the legal traditions that should have dropped out of the Athenian theological systems. Okay. But Socrates is like, I think the reason why I'm in trouble in Athens, the reason why I'm being indicted for being impious in Athens, and that's why Euthyphro and Socrates meet at King Archon's court, because they're both there doing some uh, um, work at the court. So Euthyphro is prosecuting his father, and Socrates is going to be prosecuted for impiety. And so Socrates is like, I don't believe that the gods fight in war with each other like you do. So Socrates would reject D here. So D is the gods disagree on what they love. Okay, so Euthyphro believes both B, GL, S, and D. Socrates thinks that this definition is wanting, but he's going to try to show that it is, at least initially, in the text by showing that B, GL, S, and D lead to a contradiction. Okay, so Socrates himself rejects D. What he's doing is he's showing that Euthyphro's committed himself to a contradiction in terms of his belief system. Okay, so I like to consider this Socrates' initial reply to the second definition, because it'll turn out, and this is just, I'm going to plant a seed here, so remember that I say this, it's going to turn out that Socrates' response to the third definition, where we universalize being God-loved, we get BGLU, remember, will also apply to this definition, BGLS. So I like to call this sometimes just the initial objection to the second definition. Okay. So what I've done on this slide here, and I've talked quite a bit, but the crucial takeaway is that Socrates and Euthyphro disagree theologically on whether the gods fight in a war with each other or disagree. Okay. We see in other works, Plato through Socrates developed the idea that the gods are good, they're just, okay, maybe perfect. Okay, so at least in some sense, they're perfect. So that's an important disagreement between them. But that disagreement doesn't prevent Socrates from showing that Euthyphro's beliefs contradict, because he accepts the theological point in D and he accepts this definition BGLS. Okay, so that's at least the initial response, and then we need to capture how B, G, L, S, and D lead to a contradiction, don't we? So let's see if we can do that. So here's a reconstruction of the argument. Okay. So in the text, it's a bit perhaps more complicated in terms of the presentation, but this is, I think, the essence of what's going on. So we suppose one, that piety is being God loved, and two, the gods disagree on what they love. So one is just, right, that's just BGLS, isn't it? And two is just D. So we're just opposing the definition that's offered and D. We'll just call them 1 and 2 here, just for simplicity's sake. So we're going to suppose those. Okay, we're just spelling out what BGLS and D are as 1 and 2. Well, by 2, it's possible, isn't it, for God A to love X and for God B to hate X. So the way you would model, wouldn't you, 2, or D, is by having one God love some action, let's say, and another God hate it, or at least not love it. That would capture the idea of disagreement about what's loved. Okay. And we could even use the example that we have in the text ready to hand. Suppose when Zeus sees the prosecution of wrongdoers, he loves it. And suppose that when Kronos, Zeus's father, who was punished by Zeus for wrongdoing, sees the prosecution of wrongdoers, he hates it. It reminds him of the terrible punishment. Okay, so just for arguments, like let's see, we can fill in the value, the variables here with values. So I put the point very generally here. Okay, but we could fill in the variables with values by saying it's possible for Zeus to love prosecuting wrongdoers, and for Kronos to hate it, to hate the prosecution of wrongdoers. And then by 1 and 2, so we are going to apply piety as being God loved. We're going to apply that to this possibility that emerges from 2. And we get it's possible for X to be both pious and impious, right? Because if it's God loved, then it's pious. So in virtue of Zeus loving the prosecution of wrongdoers, or virtue of Zeus loving X, then X is pious. But then in virtue of Kronos hating prosecuting wrongdoers, or X, then X is impious, isn't it? So here, of course, we can, if we wanted, add to 1, and impiety is being God hated. Okay. If you want, we can fill that in, and then that'd be how you get to it's possible for X to be both pious and impious. Okay. So if it's helpful, you know, we can go ahead and just do that. See, so 1 just has 2 parts to it. Okay. And then here's supposed to be the intuitive thought. Again, as we try to capture Socrates' challenge, it's impossible though for X to be both pious and impious. X is one or the other, right? Or it's impossible for X to be both pious and not pious. And one way of not being pious is to be impious. And so you could easily establish this, supposing that's the case. So then it looks like we have a contradiction, right? A contradiction holding between this point and this point, between the second point and the third point under the supposition. So let this be what we'll call our supposition, and this is point 1, point 2, point 3, and this will be our conclusion. Okay, and again, we can build that in. Okay, for supposition, and this is our conclusion, and then this will be 1, this will be 2, and this will be 3. Whoops. See how that goes? Okay, kind of working through this way kind of slowly. That way you can, as I might do if I were teaching you in class, and this is the whiteboard, adding the relevant detail. Okay. So the idea is that 2 and 3 contradict. So that allows us to come up to what we supposed and reject it. Okay. So here's the strategy. You suppose that something is true for argument's sake. So think about what we do when we suppose something. Imagine you're arguing with someone. It doesn't have to be a heated argument. You're having a conversation about something political or personal or whatever, philosophical, hopefully. And you say, okay, so here's your view. And you say, well, suppose blah. And then you show that there's a problem with what you've supposed. You show that there's a problem with blah. So that gives you reason to reject blah, doesn't it? It gives you reason to reject the supposition. So one of the worst things that can happen when you suppose something is that it leads to a contradiction. Okay. It leads to something contradictory. Okay? So so you're like, okay, now well, what's a contradiction then? Well, you have an intuitive sense of what it is, I'm sure. A logical contradiction is a sentence of the form P and not P. Take any sentence P, any sentence not P, that's a contradiction. So how's it going to go? Easy example. It is raining, that's our P. Logical contradiction would form when we say and it's not raining. It's raining and it's not raining. So if you have an idea, a supposition, it could be multiple ideas, as this one has, and it leads to a logical contradiction, a sentence of the form P and not P, then what you've supposed is problematic. It's worth rejecting. And isn't 3 just easy to put into a logical contradiction form? Right, or I should say, 2 and 3 you can put into, we could have created a 4 where you end up with a contradiction. It's possible for X to be both pious and impious, and it's impossible for X to be both pious and impious. More complicated sentence than it's raining and it's not raining, but it's still the case that 2 and 3 are logically contradictory. And we can easily do that by just having a step 4 where we combine 2 and 3 and use and instead of but. I mean, the term but in English just functions as logically as a conjunction, as an and. So a conjunction is the logical name for and. I mean, but is just, the term but is just and, logically speaking. Okay. So that's how we get the contradiction. But then, as we've said, if you have a supposition that leads to a contradiction, 2 and 3 lead to a contradiction, 2 and 3 are a contradiction, then you can reject your supposition. And here's what we've done. We've rejected our supposition by denying 1. So the supposition here is a conjunction 2, isn't it? It's an and sentence. And in order for an and sentence to be true, or a logical conjunction to be true, both parts of the and sentence have to be true. We call the parts of a conjunction conjuncts. Okay. So if it's helpful, if it's helpful, let me go ahead and escape here. Let me go ahead and do this. Here's the term conjunction. These are and sentences. Okay, these are and sentences. And a lot of ands going on here. We call the parts conjuncts. Okay. And for conjunction to be true, all the parts have to be true. Both parts have to be true in this case, but you can imagine a conjunction has more than 2 parts. Now, I went to the park today. I had peanut butter and jelly for lunch today. I studied some Euthyphro today. I lectured on Euthyphro today. That's 4 parts. In order for that conjunction to be true, all 4 parts have to be true. It turns out that all those are true. Okay. I go to the park a lot. I have I have twin daughters that are 21 months old. Get that out of my mouth. And so I'm very busy on that front. We're family building now. My wife is also pregnant with our 3rd baby. We're not having twins this time. Due in October. So anyways, that's some personal info. That's why I go to parks a lot. And my daughters and I love to enjoy peanut butter and jelly sandwiches together. Any PB&J lovers out there? Okay, I can't see your hands, but I'll do this to those of you who are PB&J lovers. Okay, so I'm gonna erase this now, but get it in your notes if it's helpful for you. Some of you already know this because you've taken some logic or your computer science majors or something like that. One is a conjunction. Okay, one is a conjunction, and you'd show that one is wrong by denying either one or two, or showing that one or two is false. And the way that Socrates concludes is by saying that, well, one is wrong. Okay. The reason why he does that is because Socrates is aware of the fact that Euthyphro would not reject his theology. Remember, he's a traditionalist with respect to his theology. He's not giving it up. Or to say he's orthodox with respect to his theology. He's not giving that up. Okay? If it's helpful, I'll do this as well. Yeah, like I'm working on a whiteboard here, but on a PowerPoint slide. A contradiction is a sentence of the form P and not P. Okay? And 2 and 3 exhibit that form. Okay? So that's, this is what we call a logical contradiction. Okay? And the form of the argument, let me go ahead and I'm going to erase these now. Hopefully you have them. You can always obviously rewind and get them again. But the form of the argument of this argument here is suppose P, and then you have some premises, premise, 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 and then you get a contradiction. Let's do this. Since I used P above already, we'll suppose Q, and then we'll get a Q or P and not P. So that allows us to conclude. What does it allow us to conclude? Logically. So not Q, right? So you suppose something, some non-empty set of claims, meaning this could be one claim, two claims, three claims, 1,000 claims. Okay, have fun with that, with that kind of proof. Right? You suppose some claim, it leads to a contradiction, P and not P. And so that means you can reject what you suppose, Q. That's just not Q, isn't it? Okay. This might be new to some of you. So if you have questions about the logic here, reach out, let me know how I can help you with that. That's really the form of this argument as we've rationally reconstructed it. You don't find this logical way of working things out in the text in this way, but this is a reconstruction of it. In a way, Socrates puts it intuitively by way of conversation, but in order to simplify what's going on in the text, I lay it out in a step-by-step way, showing you this form. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Okay, actually, before I do, let's just give this a name. This is sometimes called proof by contradiction, because you prove something by showing that a contradiction emerges with what's supposed. It's also sometimes called reductio ad absurdum, but I'll get there. Okay. So, anyways, proof by contradiction. Okay, very prominent kind of proof method in mathematics, as it turns out, and in philosophy. Okay, and it has its origins in someone like Socrates, even though it wasn't formalized until later in the history of philosophy. Okay, you might say it was intuitively there, like Socrates, like has this intuitive logic that doesn't, and then this doesn't get formalized until later. Okay, so 2 legacy points to conclude with here. So, okay, we'll see that Socrates objects all 5 of Euthyphro's definitions, and associated with these Objections are legacy points, ideas that are part of Socrates' legacy as a philosopher. So things to just keep in mind, these are aspects of Socrates' philosophy or Plato's philosophy through Socrates that have withstood the test of philosophical time, if you will. Okay. And to this point in our study, we looked at two objections to Euthyphro's definitions. So let me just modify that mistake. So thus there's two legacy points to note or recap. The first one is the Socratic definitions point. We know what Socrates is looking for when he asks the question, what is piety, or just what is X? So Socrates is a moral philosopher who is dominantly interested in moral topics, including what is piety, and in other works, things like what is love, what is justice, what is courage, and the like. So when he asks the question, what is X, he's looking for the form or essence or the nature of X. He's looking for the universal characteristic that everything that counts as an X, that has in common, that explains why they're X. So that's part of Socrates' legacy. That's part of the legacy of the Euthyphro, is to teach us in part what a Socratic definition is. And then this bit that we just talked about, so I don't need to say much more here, but this proof by contradiction method, okay, which again doesn't get formalized until later, but at least the seeds of it are developed in Plato's Euthyphro. Okay, either Socrates had the idea and Plato's giving us that idea through the text, or Plato through Socrates is teaching us this this way of arguing, this method for trying to prove something. Okay, in the tradition, it later gets to be known as reductio ad absurdum, which in Latin means reduction to absurdity, where you take a supposition, remember your Q, and you show that it leads to an absurdity. Well, what's a logical absurdity? A contradiction. Okay, and from there you can argue that the opposite of what you've supposed is true. Okay, now note when we go back to this point, note that strictly speaking, 2 could be false as well, and Socrates thinks that 2 is false. But keep in mind that Socrates in this conversation with Euthyphro is just going to say, look, I know you're not going to deny 2, so you have to deny 1, given that my argument has succeeded, and it seems like it has. So then Euthyphro, what he needs to do next is offer a revised definition. And we know what that definition is going to be. It's going to be BGLU. He's going to find a way out of the contradiction by defining piety in terms of the love of the gods, but universalizing the love of the gods. Now, see if you can think about this until next time. How would universalizing the love of the gods allow Euthyphro to maintain D, namely the claim that the gods disagree about what they love, without endorsing a contradiction? Okay, without without BGLU and D, put more precisely, leading to a contradiction. Okay. Okay. So he thinks that he can avoid a contradiction by defining piety in terms of what all the gods love. Okay, but still maintaining that the gods disagree about what they love, so he can maintain his theology. Right. So now the question is to ask yourself: one, can he avoid a contradiction like he thinks he can? And if he can, how does that work? Okay, so I'll answer that question first thing next time. Okay, and here in the discussion of this definition, we're going to get one of the most famous discussions from the history of philosophy, and one of the most famous questions from the history of philosophy. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop sharing and stop here. Wish you all well, and I'll see you next time. Take care.